Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Amos Wolf. I'm the Director of Education and Networking for the New York Marriage and Family Therapy Network, and I'm so thrilled that you're all here today. Just a little bit of background on what this next hour is going to be, and then we'll get started. So the new NYMFTN created programming this week, which was creating 5 different small open mics, so safe spaces where people can have difficult conversations about issues that are affecting us as therapists and also as humans.
All right, here we go.
So these were spaces for people who are thinking about how to be a therapist as an activist, how young students or of young minds are embracing I don't know, how we embrace classism as a mental health practitioner in both private practice and the public sector, a space for Black clinicians and African-American clinicians to gather and discuss how they can support one another, and a place for those who are from police and from police families and who work with that population to begin to discuss how we can better serve those people who serve us. So this is the culmination of that discussion. We're going to have our moderators speak, and we're going to ask that you keep your mics muted the whole time. What you can do is use the chat function to contribute to the conversation. And so we'll try to engage some of that in dialogue, but please know that if we don't get to answer your question, we're recording this, and so we'll have all of your wonderful feedback, all of your wonderful thoughts, suggestions, be a part of where we can drive. This is really beyond networking, about community, about trying to build community as New Yorkers and beyond to feel like we have support in this time of great divide and great isolation. So I really appreciate you all for being here, and I look forward to talking with you shortly. I'm going to take this moment to pass off my mic to Salia Bava, who is a mentor and professor of mine. And so we're also sort of modeling that exchange of student to teacher. Again, if you're coming in, just please keep your videos off and your mics muted for the whole time. Thank you so much. Salia, please take it over.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I just want to take a minute for us to ground ourselves.
Salia, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, David. So take a moment to take a breath, connect with the environment around you. Just notice, bring in expansion. And with every breath you're taking in, bring in connection. And notice where these ideas, where our words land for you. Notice where it sits in your experience, and notice what it brings up for you and how that might be a call for action. As you listen, keep connecting to both yourself and beyond, to the social and the self in this moment. And with that, I invite Dr. David Hooker, who led our Therapist as Activist and Community Organizer, to take us forward into that conversation. And welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you. So good morning, all. I had the opportunity, privilege to facilitate a conversation among people who were actively engaged or inquiring about what are the possibilities for therapists to also be activists or community organizers. What are the possibilities? What, if any, boundaries are there? What are some of the constraints that exist, or what are some of the sticky, ethical, or practical, pragmatic aspects of the work? And what we ended up doing was not trying to find solutions, but we were invited by one of the participants to live into the questions. And so there were several questions that we were left with that I'm really just bringing into the space for our conversation this morning, because these are questions that both help think through, they help us to be not what thinkers, but how thinkers. I think that's the expression, is how to be how thinkers. Like, how do we even think about, where do we place our gaze as we engage in these questions? And so what were some of the questions that we that we were left with or that we wrestled with for a period. The first one is that, you know, our clients, the people that we work with individually and collectively, come from communities. They are naturally existing in context, and we know that. And if we know that they're existing in context, and as therapists, we are, you know, for all intents and purposes, we are advocates. We are advocates for their best living, for their full flourishing. And so how, if at all, can we advocate for their full flourishing without in some way also advocating for changes in the conditions and the context in which they live? And so the issue is the continuum from just being a therapist working directly and individually with a group or a family along a continuum to the point where you are organizing or being an activist. What, if any, boundaries are there? What are the bright lines? What are the ethical questions along the continuum as we occupy those spaces? And so that's something that we wrestle with. We haven't come to the end of it, but if we know that therapists are well positioned to be activists, organizers, to be advocates at all times. And so where, if any, bright lines are there? We also wondered where and how therapists might serve or bring their therapeutic, their healing approaches to those who are activists and organizers as part of activism, as part of organizing. There is a way in which activism can reactivate, can stimulate, can even cause trauma among those who are seeking the change. And so how, if at all, do we contribute to their activism? So that was one set of, do we contribute to their healing during their activist moments, their organizing practices? So that's one set of questions that we wrestled with. Another set of questions that we wrestled with were just what the impact is on the therapeutic relationship if, because we as, you know, therapists also, we as, you know, in a therapeutic community, we also exist in those contexts. And so if we, for our own needs and commitments, choose to go into the streets, for instance, as a kind of a metaphor for activism, but if we choose to go into the streets, what's the impact on the therapeutic relationship? If we have clients who see us there, who engage us there, is it just a difference of context, or is it completely different in kind from a client seeing us in a grocery store? You know, your client is vegan and they see you at the butcher shop, and what, you know, that's going to have some therapeutic impact. But seeing you in the streets, like knowing that you now have certain commitments that they may or may not have. So we wrestle with what are the therapeutic impacts, and also the therapeutic impacts for you where you have commitments to seeing community change, and your clients may benefit from that change, but they haven't necessarily taken that on as their mission yet, their journey, their way of being yet. What's the impact on the therapeutic or the relationship in that way? Completely another set of questions. We're still living into the questions. So set of questions. What is the internal work that needs to be done for therapists before they go into the streets, before they take on activist roles? What is the internal work that they need to do so that we don't go into the street as savior? You know, we already operate in a helping mode, but there is a line between being help, being support, being companion, providing accompaniment, and being savior. And sometimes we don't always hear the click without the switch, without necessarily having some support. So what are the necessary supports? What's the necessary internal work that needs to be done? And then the final set of questions was an interesting set of questions around those who are engaged in systems, either employed by systems or doing work with clients who are in systems, for instance, in schools, in prisons. If your work and your source of income support, your financial support, is being paid from the system, for instance, are you working, how do you advocate in ways Are you working for the system? Or are you working for the client? Particularly when it's possible that empowering or creating a space where the client feels a sense of agency, increased agency, if they're in a school setting, a punitive school setting, a prison setting, or something like this, where their sense of increased agency may actually create them as, or put them in a more precarious circumstance, make them more exposed to danger. How does that work? And also, if you're working inside of and for a repressive system, knowing that it will have its repressive impacts on you, particularly for Black, Indigenous, people of color, it's working on you as well. How do you avoid the hypocrisy of working with the client while you're also being repressed by that same set of systemic forces and factors? And so we started off living into the questions, we ended up living into the questions, but because clients are people and groups of people that benefit from our advocacy, we still have to ask and answer these questions. What's the extent to which our advocacy can go? Is there a bright line? Is there a set of inquiry or questions that allow us to make a case-by-case analysis? And so how would we think about that? So if there's not a rule, then we are not what thinkers, we have to be how thinkers. And so what, if any, forms of inquiry are there that we could benefit from? So that's part of what we came up with, or what we did in our time. And I'm looking forward to hearing even from the other moderators about where they might have touched a similar set of questions, or what they might say to the group that I was with. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, David. And as we continue this conversation, just again, an encouragement to use the chat. If the questions that David mentioned came up in the group sparked questions or further thought from you, feel free to join in this dialogue by using the chat function. I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Christiana Awasan, who led our Student and Emerging Professionals group, which was entitled Embracing I Don't Know. Christiana, if you can unmute yourself, I think.
Trying.
There you go.
Okay, there we go. I didn't have permission at first. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Amos, for the introduction. It's good to see everyone virtually today. So we discussed, we were in the group Embracing I Don't Know, the student and emerging professional experiences. And in that group, we basically had majority of students who were either going into their first years or their second year, or students who young graduates who just graduated from their master's program. And a lot of the questions that came up around not knowing is also connected to what David was talking about earlier, which is just relationship, the therapeutic relationship. So we had two sets of, we kind of quantify it in this way, that there are two sets of I don't know. There's the I don't know because we are afraid to ask questions, right? Or we don't want to ask questions because we don't know how our clients will respond to us. And there are the I don't knows that are totally outside of our control. Like, we literally don't know the answer. So we need to kind of engage our clients to help us understand and for us also to do the work. So one of the I don't knows that we talked about is really helping the clients understand that they are the experts in their own life and in their own relationship. That and that as the therapist, that we do have expertise in understanding what relational dynamics looks like, what mental health looks like, being able to assess. So we have skills in that, but we don't have skills in the lives of the clients. So really being clear on the power that we have within the clients have expertise on their life, and we have expertise as clinicians, right? And being able to say, I don't know X, Y, and Z about your life. And in my training, in my understanding, these are the things that I know, and also going with that. And then there are the I don't knows that are out of our controls, right? We don't know. One of the things that we talked about a lot is social cultural trauma. And one of the social cultural trauma that we spoke about was racism, right? we don't know when racism is going to end. We don't know how racism is going to end. But one of the things that we can do is really help our clients, particularly our Black and Indigenous and clients of color, to really fortify themselves in really sheltering their mental health, emotional health, relational health from the pain of racism. One of the things that one of the participants shared, and a lot of people shared this too, how you bring yourself into the therapy room. So one of the participants talked about being Black, Muslim, and also a female, like what will happen if a client doesn't accept them, right? Or doesn't want to work with them. So we talked about that too, that is a huge, I don't know, but how do you actually bring yourself to the therapy room, being able to actually identify, like social locate yourself, identify who you are, and also connect with the clients from there. Well, what if the client also still says, I don't want to work with you? So we talked about really engaging in dialogue, relational dialogue with the client to really understand why the client feels that way. Another thing that we talked about is, how do you bring up whiteness in therapy, right? How do you bring up the topic of whiteness and not make it about the therapist, but also connecting with the client? So we talked about how that is a difficult space to be at right now in our society. And that's something that we need to continue to work on within the field of mental health. But we talked about it in terms of really using it as a relational connection for our clients, asking the question around the ways in which their whiteness might impact their relationship with themselves and other people in their lives, and also other people that they see in the street as well. So we talked about like a variety of issues, and really coming down to, yes, there are some things that we do know, and to kind of take ownership of that and to use our power responsibly. And there are some things that we don't know. That's just the nature of our work, because we're dealing with human beings and we're dealing with human experiences, and we don't know everything about human beings and human experiences. So really going into the therapy room with a humble heart, with a heart of curiosity, wanting to kind of really understand more, really couching it in relational ethics of all of that. So that's what we came up with.
Thank you so much, Christiana. So we're going in order, right, of how these emerged. And it was really based on our moderators' availability, but it's sort of a wonderful progression that we're seeing as we go. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Maria Villanova, LMFT, who led our classism and mental health, private practice versus public sector. Maria, let me know if you need help turning on your mic. Okay. Great, try now, if you unmute.
Thank you, Amos. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Villanova. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist working in both private and public sectors, while also being a faculty member at Mercer College. I facilitated the open mic discussion on classism and mental health, private versus public service. During the open mic discussion that we held on Wednesday, July 15, the discussion mainly focused on dissecting classism relative to racism, capitalism, and economic access. Due to the complexity, we needed more time, and that speaks to the importance of this topic, as people are interested, and NYMFTN might want to consider making more time to discuss how to navigate classism. Though we were not able to touch on the difference of how therapists navigate classism in private and public services. This discussion speaks to how classism is relevant and much needed area of examination in our mental health field. It is crucial for all mental health clinicians to increase their awareness of how classism manifests in a therapeutic alliance. Based on my observations that I've collected from the work I've done in both private and public sectors, clients that I consider or label as poor or working class are perceived negatively, while also being treated unfairly, more than those who come from more privileged background. Clinicians working for public sectors may experience pressure from requirement of providing services, not allowing them to advocate if they have clients who are in need of these services but are not able to afford it. Through working in private practice, clinicians have the room to be flexible in providing services, but it can also become problematic when the therapist's own economy agendas get in place. One concept that was brought up by participants was the notion of how language carries classism and how an unpacked notion of professionalism can promote classism. Language has been used by dominant cultures to identify who's privileged and who's not, and this has resulted in social injustice. Language can also become an impediment in a therapeutic setting when working with clients who have not been privileged enough to have access to education, which in part increases life options and greater access to social justice. These clients end up developing their own style of communication that is not similar to the therapist. The process of developing a therapeutic alliance and embracing social justice is interrupted if the therapy fails to see one's positionality. The following question was presented during our group discussion. How do we join and sit with people that have different language of expressing themselves or have a hard time describing what has taken place in their lives and stay silent? Another point that came up during the group discussion was unpaid internships for MFT students, and that reinforces capitalism. Only those who come from a more privileged background can afford to secure unpaid internship and get the experience necessary to practice in our field. Those who don't have the financial flexibility are forced to be left behind as they're unable to support themselves and or their families. This in particular has become a part of the system that divides classes even more. And some of the questions that were brought up as well for today's discussion were, how do we talk about classism in therapy? And how do we organize a system that will embrace social economy instead of oppressing equal opportunity to help those entering our field?
Thank you so much. That's a big question, but we'll definitely hope to touch on it. I'm going to pass the mic over to Cheryl Donald, LMFT and MBA. Cheryl, I just unmuted you. So if you unmute yourself, we should be set.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Amos. And thank you for those of you who've joined us today. And thank you to the clinicians who joined our discussion actually yesterday morning, entitled the Black Clinicians Collective. And our discussion was an opportunity to talk about the significance of being a Black clinician, both personally and to the community. We talked about cultural responsibility to our clients, both our Black and non-Black, non-clients of color. We talked about the clinician's role in the Black Lives Matter movement, if we had any. We talked about that. And then we also discussed our responsibility to our fellow clinicians of color, so that community within the mental health field. And then finally, we talked about some next steps and closeouts. So in terms of being a Black clinician and some of the significance around that, we talked about being culturally competent within a space, and also the fact that representation matters. So psychotherapy and mental health has traditionally been a very white profession, and very rarely do we see clinicians of color from non-dominant backgrounds. And so we talked about representation, providing connection and community feel that allows for people to open up, and also using representation as a tool to help further therapy with our clients of color. We also spoke about the significance of being Black clinicians and breaking the mental health stigma that seems to run rampant in communities of color, and also to encourage our clients to seek therapy more as a primary care model versus an emergency room model of accessing mental health services. We talked about reducing misdiagnosis and over medication, and about how some behaviors that are seen in communities of color can often be pathologized simply due to misunderstanding. And then, of course, better access to community resources and existing literature on the Black community and specifically Black psychology. When we talked about cultural responsibility to clients, we talked about the fact that there's an unavoidable self here. We cannot hide our Blackness with our clients. So the importance of acknowledging it and being transparent and being able to open up about color and race, especially with non-Black clients, and how ignoring race and the impact of race can actually potentially harm clients, and how to help, and how can we be helpful if we're not actually transparent. We also talked about providing sliding scales to enable access to clients of color, and then also giving clients a space to have a therapist that looks like them by providing this affordable option. We discussed that there are actually two pandemics actually impacting on our country right now in our community, one of them being COVID, of course, and also racism, both of which are disproportionately impacting communities of color, and the importance of holding space for our clients to process this in our therapy rooms. When it comes to the clinician role in Black Lives Matter, I think we all came to an agreement that whether or not we want to be part of the movement, we are part of the movement because our clients are experiencing this and bringing it into the therapy room. So one of our participants referenced us as honorary members of the Black Lives Matter movement, whether we want to be or not, that we're honorary fixers, and that we have multiple roles as we negotiate constantly trying to address the current civil unrest that may present itself in our therapy rooms. So we talked about amplifying our voice to make sure that we are comfortable. We talked about identifying where we want to do the work and if we have the bandwidth to do so, and how that looks, and acknowledging that it may look different amongst different people. So talking a little bit about that therapist as activist space that David spoke of earlier. Also supporting our clients on how they can encourage themselves and engage in the movement and what activism looks like. And of course, we talked about balancing self-care and helping our clients. We talked about Black fatigue, the constant dialogue around what it's like to be Black, how can we be better, how can we help the Black community, and really hearing that from our places of work. Our clients are hearing it from places of work, from their non-Black colleagues and friends, and that it can just be exhausting, and creating a space of acknowledgement for that. We talked about our responsibility to each other as clinicians of color, and we discussed connecting with one another and understanding that just because we are all clinicians of color and Black clinicians, that does not mean that we have shared experiences, shared backgrounds, and the importance of being able to acknowledge that and understand that we can learn from each other and be value added in terms of enriching our individual and collective practices. And then, of course, we talked about the fact that private practice can be isolating for those who are in private practice, and even those who are not in private practice. It can be isolating when there are very few clinicians that look like you. And so some of the future steps that we talked about in the group were around creating a resource for Black clinicians within the New York MFT network, where they can collaborate and connect with one another, to also include cross referrals, so that we can acknowledge some of our clients' requests to have providers that look like them and be a conduit for that connection. And then, of course, we talked about mentorship and connecting Black students with seasoned therapists specifically, and also mentoring clinicians of color at various levels. And then finally, taking the initiative to create safe spaces with one another, even if it's something that is informal as an ad hoc Zoom call or conference calls, and that we don't necessarily need to wait for the MFT network to bring us together, that we can do that amongst ourselves. So brief summary there, and look forward to having a discussion later.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. So I'm passing the mic to our final group, which is Dr. Debra Moore, and she led our group, which is working with police families and police officers. So welcome, Debra.
Thank you so much, Amos, and good morning to everybody. And I would like to thank everyone that participated in the open mic discussion yesterday on working and living with police families. So we started off the conversation by asking the question, how does the current political, social, racial climate affect your work as either a professional working with police and families, or if you were an emerging professional wanting to work with this population, or perhaps if you were a police officer or a spouse or family member of a police officer. So how does this affect you? Now, our group discussion was like a planted tree that had many roots, and it branched in several directions. So what I want to do is just take this opportunity to summarize some of the key components or the key takeaways that was echoed during this conversation. Some of the emergent themes came about with, there's a big need to understand the police culture. So understand, re-educate, these were some of the key terms that were needed. We need to have an understanding, or clinicians, mental health practitioners need to have an understanding about how to work with this population. Somewhere along the line, it was the population or the culture of police was lost in terms of being able to provide services. So the education was centered on even understanding the language of police and the culture in itself. Another emerging theme that came up was the systemic piece. As a licensed mental health and a licensed marriage and family therapist, the systemic factor of being able to address some of the needs that police officers and their families are experiencing was overlooked. There is a cyclical effect. When a police officer is experiencing job-related stress, it certainly can impact their family. So that was something that was called to attention about how we can address the systemic factor in being able to work with police as well as their families. Another issue that came up was trust. How can this trust between, or mistrust rather, between police and clinicians, police and community, how can that be repaired? And I do need to point out too, these were grand topics, and by no way was anything being solved within this period of time, but it did plant the seed for future conversations and much more dialogue. The last element that was addressed or mentioned was about humanity. And that humanity was humanity in terms of us as mental health professionals, practitioners in the field. Some participants shared that when they mentioned this open mic discussion to some of their colleagues or friends, they were criticized. Some colleagues mentioned, why would you attend a group on police families and culture? So that also, again, goes in with understanding the culture, understanding the systemic piece. Other participants mentioned about their role as a family member of a police officer, where they had felt ashamed because of the work that their particular spouse was doing. They felt that they couldn't even disclose it out of fear of retaliation from other people. Some talked about the impact that it would have on children of police officers. So these are all factors and variables that not only affect the officer, but their family as well. And again, there comes that systemic factor. And as a licensed marriage and family therapist, that piece was missing. There was also a participant in the group who happened to have been a police officer as well as an emerging professional, and talked about their role in terms of not only facing racial issues within the broader society, but also the impact within working with that department. That piece was also lost because we have some professionals that, due to whatever political side of the coin they're on, feel that they do not want to provide services to police and their families, which to me is just very disheartening to hear and to have heard within the group. So the main takeaways that really stemmed from this group was the need to educate practitioners and how to work and understand this culture regardless of what their political side of the coin is. Where has humanity gone? Our role is to help and assist. And it seems that due to this current political climate, and I do understand this was the nature of this whole put together of the network, that when we're looking at the big picture of things, we're missing the other smaller variables. Like, how is this not only affecting the political cause or the social cause or the racial injustices, but there are also a systemic piece to this that we're not addressing. So hopefully this will jumpstart future conversations and figure out ways in which we can assist other cultures that are being castigated because of their chosen profession and be able to assist them effectively. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And if all of our moderators could turn on your video and mics, just so that we can open this up for a bit more of a discussion, that would be great. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we only have 20 minutes. And so just like Deborah said, this is planting the seed for dialogue. We are not going to solve any of these questions. We may be able to come up with some more questions, but that's really going to be the focus. So, you know, I'm going to unmute all of our moderators if that's been an issue. And I look forward to seeing where this conversation goes. If anyone feels inspired to begin, feel free. I'm sure that
So I actually have a question, both Deborah and for Cheryl. Maria, this may have touched on your conversation as well. I'm wondering, when you have clinicians counterparts that are working with clients, and you can observe from your perspective that they may not have fully embraced the culture of their clients. For instance, if you're a Black clinician and you're working and you have colleagues who aren't Black who are working with Black clients, and they don't seem to understand, so they're pathologizing some aspects of the culture. What, if any, responsibility or what are the practices that you have for working with, because they're not like you're not supervising them, you're colleagues with them. And similarly, like Deborah, if you're aware of clinicians that are having trouble working with police and police families, or if there's a linguistic issue or a class issue, what, if any, responsibility do we have throughout the network, throughout the community, to work to assist, to correct, to try and invite our colleagues into a different and more effective or sensitive, culturally appropriate way of being?
David, I'll start. That was actually something that we discussed in the Black Clinicians Collective open mic, around the tendency to pathologize what you don't know or what you don't understand. And oftentimes we don't know how much of that is actually happening, right? And I think what you're referring to is if we happen to have a conversation about our clients with therapists that don't look like us, and they share with us what they're doing with their clients, how would we respond? And I think any of us as professionals and as humans, and with any type of ethics, would probably have a professional discussion on things that maybe they have not taken into consideration, or things that they have not had the privilege of understanding or experiencing from the perspective of a client who comes from a non-dominant ethnicity or experience, right? And so it's really scary because we don't know how much of that is happening. And that's one of the reasons why we believe representation matters, right? So that there is a voice, that there are different voices and different perspectives similar to what we're doing today, so that we can create an opportunity for dialogue that all of us as professionals can bring into our individual therapy rooms. And also one of the things that we talked about was the importance of networking as Black clinicians, also to share how we can approach that, so that we can come to our colleagues who may not have the benefit of that knowledge in a way that's collegial and supportive and ultimately benefits our clients that we're seeing.
Yes, and to comment on what Cheryl said, I think we don't know how much of that is happening. But now I'm going to speak specifically about police, because that's what you addressed. So ironically, before this change in social, political issues that we are experiencing, I would offer courses to clinicians so that they can be they can educate themselves on how to work with the police population. And that course would be full. You know, I would have a full house. So I think because of our own beliefs, which we are all entitled to, you know, political, social beliefs, that may be clouding or impacting our judgment in terms of wanting to work with certain populations right now. So what can we do? I think a lot of it just stems from our own ability to understand why is it that we don't want to work with certain populations, or why are we letting our own political, social issues affect giving services to certain people. So that would be step number one. And also within the group, people mentioned sometimes we have implicit biases, things that we may not even be aware of that may come out. So this would be a good opportunity for, you know, us as clinicians to look at this. Secondly, if you're really interested, educate yourself. And that was a big issue that came up within our groups too, about re-educating, relearning. Just as if we would have to learn about any other particular culture or group that we were working with, the same thing would apply for whether you're working with a police culture or even military. You know, these are cultures of its own. So if you are genuinely interested in assisting the learn as much as you can about them.
I want to jump in here and take it in a couple of different directions. And that is picking on what you said, Debra, about educating an implicit bias, right? So it goes back to, I think, David, what you were also saying, we have to do our own work first as clinicians. The challenge that's coming up is, what does that mean in practice when, as Cheryl, you were saying, and I think a couple of you have said, when we tend to pathologize what we don't understand and don't know, right? And this pathology, it doesn't come only at the individual level, it's built into our theories, into our research practices. So how do we even know who to turn to when our sites of learning are classist, are racist, potentially, I'll put the word potentially for those who are like, how are you declaring it? But we know it's based on dominant structures. Just the activity of education is a structure of classism. So I want us to grapple with that. Thoughts?
I'll go with that real quick. I think that is a big question that we're grappling with right now in our lifetime right now, particularly in academia. I mean, I've been pulled into several meetings just this week on what are our anti-racist pedagogy, how do we dismantle using white epistemology in all of our training, in all of our teaching, right? And I think it's incumbent upon people who are the professors, the trainers, the supervisors, to bring in thoughts that are marginalized, to bring in life experiences, readings, right? Even to critique the theories that we have. One of my biggest critique in our field is emotional couples therapy. Even that notion that emotional couples therapy is for every single couple is not true, because we know that EFT is normed on white couples, right? White heterosexual middle class, upper class couple. So being able to give like a theory like that to my students and say, who are the people's voices that are not represented in this topic, right? Who are the people's voices or life experiences that this theory is not addressing? Even if you look at your own life, does it speak to you, right? And it's very important as educators to be able to help our students and trainees and supervisees to think critically about those things, like whose voices are marginalized, and also who are the people coming to therapy. When you try to use this theory on them, or even the ways in which we're teaching you, does it even work for them? So being able to notice that as well. So I think it's also us as educators, supervisors, trainer, pushing ourselves and saying, yeah, I don't know some stuff, so I need to go research and see how I can bring in other voices that are not represented in my syllabus, in our trainings, right? So that's the way I can see that.
And Christiana, we talked about this a little bit also in the Black Clinicians, that there is research out there that is targeted toward Black communities and communities of color. However, does that research make it into the classrooms? And are our students being taught this information? And I use the analogy of when I was being trained 20 years ago, I had one class on families, Black families class. And Rua, who is our secretary, was also in our group. And she talked about how there are so many more diverse opportunities as students at her particular school at Mercy College around diversity and ethnicity that just wasn't around when I was trained, right? I think I was like one of two people in my class of color. And so we have to remember that many of us who've been around for a while have been trained differently. And we have an opportunity to really access the students who are coming in now with this more diverse training. I don't think I had a professor, Christiana, like you, that even asked that question about EFT or even brought that up, right? But now those questions are being asked. And that's why it's so important for us as a network to be able to network with each other. And so as people are being trained differently, learning from our colleagues about new information that they're receiving and how we can apply it. I'm looking in the chat and we have questions about being activists as therapists and how do we separate our personal desires to be activists with how it might impact on our clients and our therapy practices, and then also talking about whiteness in therapy and classism and how do we bring all of those in. I think, as Emma said, we definitely can't hit it all today, but these are conversations that people want to have, that need to be had, and how do we create that space where we have voices that can really talk about it. We can't rely on the educational systems to do that for us.
I would also like to add too, as an academician myself, we need more of the emerging professionals, the students, to get involved in research. MFT research is very minimal, and as you've already echoed, very white-centered, white-focused. This is the opportunity for students to start delving in and challenging some of these theories, family theories that are out there, and making it more applicable to different cultures, different diversity. There is a big push to get more research within the MFT programs. And, we have a lot of instructors here on this panel, teaching professionals here. So this is a good push to have more research from our students doing this. I think that's very important. And that can also, start the ball rolling in terms of how we provide services and challenge some of the antiquated theories that are out there and make it more applicable to communities that we are serving, which also goes in line with changing the language. That's also a big thing too, about how we within the field, just changing that whole language.
Debra, I appreciate you saying that, because the issue of language came up when I attended 3 of the 5 open mics, and I want to connect it back to the language of research. I run a lab called Think Play Lab at Mercy College, and one of my emphasis is not teaching them research, but literally having student voices inform research. And I think we have to flip who gets to do research, who gets to design research, and who gets to define research. And so I just want NYMFT and to take up the agenda of, I think what Cheryl, you were saying, it's great. We're coming back to you, Cheryl, after this call, because you are a very active member, of how to put those researchers, to resources together for teachers. But I'm also going to put out a call to the researchers here who don't see themselves as researchers, but want to have a voice at the stage of design and development. You don't have to be a researcher to be included in the voice. Because I think we distance people by calling it research. And that's one way we have kept people out, because, oh, I'm not. So what's your take on how do we shift research as a site of practice, which creates that distinction or division?
So one of the things that I would say that's really, if we're going back to the questions of research, the thing that every paradigm does is it cuts off like what's a reasonable question. And so even when we start with the notion of marriage and family, we've got embedded in that certain constructs or imaginations that like really create a deviancy for the way that the vast majority of the people on the planet live in terms of how they construct and imagine family, how they construct and understand what relational practices actually are, and whether those are focused around kind of a heteronormative principle of family or marriage as the beginning site of that research. And so if we start with just giving ourselves permission to deconstruct or to step outside of the boundaries, because if we're only asking questions inside of the paradigm, then whatever the research is going to perpetuate the paradigm. So where do we get the first set of questions that allow us to move away from the notion that marriage actually means something specific, that family actually has a particular imagining? How do we move away from those things? And as we're doing this research, how do we incorporate the reality that almost all mental health has a history of repression for Black and Brown communities? There is a deep experience of the repression as a part of it, as an active part of its practice. So starting with getting out of that, then we ask questions like, what are the questions that we're using that we will then call research?
I appreciate that definition, David. Like, what do we call research? And kind of connecting with Talia, what your question also, like, how do we not delineate between researchers and clinicians, right? So the way I see it is clinicians are researchers, researchers are clinicians. So the reason why I say that is, if we think about just the act of doing therapy, right? We're going in there with a presenting problem that the client is bringing to us, and as the clinician, we have questions, right? So we go in there, gather information, just I would have if I'm a researcher, which I am a researcher, where I have questions, I go find my participant, and then I ask them all these questions. So as a clinician, you're doing the same thing, right? You're going in there, gathering information, right? Gathering data, right? When the client tells you X, you're like, okay, maybe that theory or that hunch is not right. Let's ask this other question, right? To see where I can actually help this client. And I think as systemic therapists also, we're trained to see patterns. So as clinicians, you're also picking up on patterns. I'm more of a qualitative researcher, so I'd like to really look for patterns all the time. So that's also what we're doing. We're looking for patterns. And if we're seeing like, okay, when I work with working class, let's say LGBTQ teenager, these are some of the things and these are the ways in which they describe depression, right? So I'm always listening for that. So even as a clinician, you can start writing a theoretical understanding of what that looks like. Like, does any of our theory even speaks to that population, right? And so that can be something that you can actually write about. And if you then want to do a research, like big research, then you have to get IRB and all that stuff. And this is where community is important. Collaboration is important. You don't have to do it by yourself. Collaborate with other like supervisors, professors, even colleagues who might be interested in this. I know in my classroom, whenever somebody bring up a topic, I'm like, that's a good research. Somebody picked that up. So I'm always pointing out to them like, what's a good research? And it doesn't have to be big because you already have the skills as a clinician. You're already doing that. It's just translating it into what we call research.
Another direction for NYMFT. Thank you. I'm going to pass on the mic to Amos. Thank you, Christina, for connecting it back to practice of clinicians. Appreciate it.
And I think all of our moderators, Christiana, that was such a wonderful transition back to what we've done this past week, which is research, right? We have been trying to listen to our members. We've been trying to address as an organization, as a system, how we can bring those marginalized voices, how we can bring other voices, just people who, and by marginalized, I mean people who have not been a member of NYMFTN, because we are not just MFTs, we are not just New Yorkers, we have people coming from all over. We have clergy folk, we have people who have served in the police force who are now counselors. So, you know, we're gonna put the link in order to join our organization so that you can know more. And there is a fee for this, but I just wanna recognize that as we talk about classism and accessibility, this is free for our members. And we're gonna try to work on creating more free programming so that we can have more voices come to the table. So again, this is just a beginning. I really appreciate all of you for your time, for your expertise, and for your dedication to this. I appreciate everyone who is here with us live. This is also going to be recorded, so hopefully we can begin to spread the word further. And I see all of the chats, which are, how do we have another session? How do we have another session? I am going to make a call for leadership, because we are a small and mighty organization, and we need to grow our branches in order to be able to provide the mentorship that Cheryl mentioned, in order to be able to figure out how this becomes research, how to continue our programming, how to be advocates, right? How to make sure that MFTs and all mental health practitioners are getting the same kind of support and same kind of treatment from Albany, from outside. So join AMFT, join NYMFT, and if you have the call from this to get more involved, if you want another session, if you want to lend your voice, please reach out to nymftnetwork@gmail.com in order to say, hey, I want to volunteer. I don't know quite how, but I'm interested in this. I have this skill in this. We will find a spot for you at our table because we want more voices. We have more power that way. I want to just end by thanking all of the people who have helped me create this in just a month. It was a fast and furious mission, and I have to thank Jackie Scheinfeld, Rua Atalib, Benjamin Schwab, Tess Rafferty, Jamie Olivieri, our fearless leader, Victoria Soltero, Dana Galente, who has been instrumental, MJ Merkley, who is our press person getting everything out, and all of our leaders from around the state who have spread the word. We invite you to come back. We want to make sure that this is not just New York centric in terms of New York City, but that it's full statewide, full countrywide. So final calls to action are, we are looking for leadership in chair position, which is a 2-year position, and as a treasurer, which is another 2-year position. We also have lesser obligations, but we really need to fill those spots. Thank you all so much for your time and energy today. I am humbled to be in all of your presence, not just our moderators, but also of our participants who have been so wonderful with the chat. So if we can just end, I'm gonna unmute you all if you want to turn on your cameras and just give a big wave so that we see everyone who's here. That would be really wonderful. So you're all unmuted. Thank you all for coming.